Have you ever answered a phone call that made you realize you had completely misunderstood someone who had been standing beside you for years? I used to think people always recognized love when it was right in front of them. I was wrong. The call came on a gray Tuesday morning while I was halfway through making coffee in my apartment overlooking the Chicago River. My phone buzzed across the kitchen counter with a number I did not recognize. Normally, I ignored unknown calls, especially on my only day off after working 4 straight night shifts in the intensive care unit. Something told me to answer anyway. "Is this Mason Carter?" a calm female voice asked. "Yes. This is St. Andrew Medical Center. We are trying to reach you regarding Adrian Brooks." My heart skipped for reasons I could not explain. Adrian was my coworker, a respiratory therapist who had worked beside me for almost 3 years. We had shared hundreds of exhausting shifts, rushed into countless patient rooms together, survived impossible flu seasons, celebrated coworkers' birthdays with grocery store cupcakes in the break room, and complained about hospital coffee that somehow tasted burnt every single day. We laughed together. We trusted each other during emergencies. But outside those automatic hospital doors, we barely saw one another. "Is he okay?" I asked before I even realized the words had left my mouth. There was a brief pause. "Mr. Brooks was involved in a traffic accident this morning. He is stable and receiving treatment. Your phone number is listed as his emergency contact." I stood frozen in my kitchen. My emergency contact? That had to be a mistake. Adrian had parents living in Milwaukee. He had a younger sister he talked about sometimes. He even had neighbors who often checked on his golden retriever whenever he worked double shifts. Why would my number be there instead of theirs? "Are you still with me, Mr. Carter?" the nurse asked gently. "Yes," I answered quietly. "I am coming." Less than 30 minutes later, I walked through the familiar entrance of the hospital, except everything felt strangely unfamiliar. Usually I entered through the employee doors wearing navy scrubs, with a badge clipped to my pocket. Today I walked through the main lobby in jeans and a charcoal sweatshirt, carrying nothing except my wallet and 1,000 unanswered questions. The receptionist directed me toward the surgical observation unit. Every hallway felt longer than I remembered. Every monitor beep echoed louder than usual. I knew this building almost as well as my own apartment, yet somehow I had never felt more like a stranger inside it. Outside Adrian's room, I found Linda, our charge nurse, sitting quietly with a paper cup of untouched coffee. She looked relieved the moment she saw me. "I am glad you made it," she said softly. "I still cannot believe they called me," I admitted. "There has to be some paperwork mix-up." Linda looked at me with an expression I could not quite read. It was not surprise. It was something closer to sadness. "Mason," she said carefully. There was no mistake. Before I could ask what she meant, she reached into her tote bag and pulled out a small navy notebook with Adrian's initials embossed in silver across the cover. She held it in both hands for a long moment before offering it to me. "He always carried this with him," she whispered. The nurse found it in his backpack. When they opened the emergency contact page, your name was not just written there. It was the only name there. My fingers trembled as I accepted the navy notebook, not because it looked unusual, but because Adrian had carried it almost every day, and somehow I had never once asked what was inside. Linda did not rush me. She simply sat beside me in the quiet hallway while doctors and nurses moved past with the familiar rhythm of another ordinary hospital morning. Ordinary for everyone except me. I slowly opened the front cover, expecting schedules, patient reminders, or grocery lists. Instead, neatly printed across the first page were my name, my phone number, and one short sentence written beneath them. "If anything ever happens to me, please call Mason first." I stared at the words for what felt like several minutes before I finally looked up. Why would he write this? My voice barely sounded like my own. Linda let out a slow breath. "Because that is who he trusted most." I shook my head almost immediately. "No, we are just coworkers." The moment those words left my mouth, I noticed the strange expression spreading across Linda's face. It was the same expression people wear when they realize someone has completely missed something obvious. "Mason," she said gently, "I do not think anyone else at this hospital would describe you as just coworkers." Before I could ask what she meant, another familiar voice interrupted us. It was Daniel from the emergency department, carrying 2 vending machine coffees. He handed one to Linda before noticing the notebook in my hands. His eyebrows lifted slightly. "So you finally know." I looked from one face to the other. "Know what?" Daniel sat across from me, suddenly looking far more serious than I had ever seen him during one of our chaotic overnight shifts. Do you remember last winter when your apartment building lost power during that snowstorm? I nodded. Someone left groceries outside my door while I was stuck at work. Daniel smiled faintly. That was Adrian. My forehead creased. No. The delivery receipt said anonymous. Because he wanted it to stay anonymous. I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out. Daniel continued quietly. Do you remember when your mother needed emergency surgery in Milwaukee and you could not get 3 consecutive days off? Of course I remembered. It had been one of the worst weeks of my life. Someone volunteered to cover 2 of your night shifts, Daniel said. Adrian traded his vacation days without telling you. I felt the hallway become strangely smaller around me. Memories I had never questioned suddenly returned one after another, like puzzle pieces finally finding their places. The coffee that mysteriously appeared on my locker every Monday after difficult weekends. The children's book left on my desk after I mentioned wanting ideas for the patient reading program. The birthday cake everyone claimed had come from the entire respiratory department, even though Adrian had stayed unusually late that evening. Every memory looked different now. Every ordinary kindness carried a face I had somehow failed to see. Why did nobody tell me? I finally asked. Linda smiled sadly. Because Adrian asked us not to. Why? Daniel answered this time. He said friendship freely given was worth more than affection returned out of guilt. His words settled over me with unexpected weight. I looked once more toward the closed hospital room where Adrian still slept, connected to machines that monitored every heartbeat, while completely unaware that his carefully protected secret had quietly escaped into the hallway. I lowered my eyes back to the notebook, turning another page almost without thinking. Tucked neatly inside was a faded movie ticket from nearly 2 years earlier. Across the back, in Adrian's unmistakable handwriting, were 6 words that stole every bit of air from my lungs. I almost told him today. I could not. The faded movie ticket stayed between my fingers long after the hallway had grown quiet again. I turned it over several times, hoping another sentence would appear, something that explained why Adrian had never finished whatever he had wanted to say that day. Instead, the silence inside those 6 words became louder the more I looked at them. I almost told him today. I could not. It was impossible not to wonder how many different days had ended exactly the same way. Before I could sink any deeper into those thoughts, Linda gently touched my shoulder. His sister is driving in from Milwaukee, but it will take another couple of hours. The doctor said he will probably stay asleep until the medication wears off. Would you help me bring a few things from his employee locker? I nodded almost automatically. Walking through the staff corridor felt surreal. Every corner reminded me of ordinary conversations with Adrian. We had joked about broken vending machines, complained about endless paperwork, argued over baseball scores, and shared quick lunches that always ended too soon because another patient needed us. I had believed those moments were simply part of working together. Now each memory seemed to carry another layer that I had never noticed. Linda unlocked the employee locker room and stopped in front of a narrow gray locker with Adrian's name printed neatly across a plastic label. Take whatever his family might need, she said before quietly stepping outside to give me privacy. The locker looked exactly as I imagined Adrian would keep it. Everything was organized with almost impossible precision. Folded scrubs sat on one shelf beside an extra pair of running shoes. A travel coffee mug rested beside packets of instant oatmeal and protein bars. There was a framed photograph of his parents standing beside a lake, smiling into the summer sun, and another picture of his golden retriever wearing a ridiculous birthday hat. I smiled without thinking. Then I noticed a small wooden box tucked behind a stack of medical journals. It was not locked. Inside were dozens of small keepsakes that looked completely ordinary until I recognized them one by one. A visitor badge from the children's hospital fundraiser where I had volunteered 2 years earlier. A coaster from the neighborhood cafe where I had once convinced Adrian to try cinnamon cold brew for the first time. A tiny paper crane folded from blue hospital admission paperwork. At the bottom lay a collection of Polaroid pictures taken during employee holiday parties, charity walks, and hospital picnics. In every photograph, Adrian stood somewhere nearby, never too close, always smiling naturally whenever I happened to be in the frame. I laughed softly at one picture where I wore a ridiculous holiday sweater covered in flashing reindeer lights. I remembered everyone teasing me that evening except Adrian. He had simply told me the sweater looked cheerful. At the time, I thought he was just being polite. Now I wondered how many compliments I had dismissed because they came wrapped in his quiet voice. Tucked beneath the photographs was a plain white envelope with my first name written across the front in careful handwriting. My pulse immediately quickened. I hesitated for several long seconds before opening it, telling myself it could have been anything. Inside was only a single folded sheet of paper. The first line made my chest tighten before I even reached the second sentence. Dear Mason, if you are reading this, then life has probably interrupted my plans once again because I never found the courage to tell you these things while we were both simply walking through ordinary days together. I unfolded the letter with more care than I had ever given any piece of paper in my life, almost afraid that reading the words would somehow make them too real to carry. Adrian's handwriting was steady and familiar, the same neat lettering I had seen countless times on patient charts and shift reports. Dear Mason, if you are reading this, then life has probably interrupted my plans once again because I never found the courage to tell you these things while we were both simply walking through ordinary days together. The next sentence stopped me completely. You once told me that the best people never realize how much light they bring into a room. I wanted to tell you that you were describing yourself. I closed my eyes for a moment, suddenly remembering that conversation. It had happened nearly 18 months earlier after we finished a 16-hour shift during a brutal winter storm. We had stopped at a 24-hour diner because neither of us wanted to cook. I had been talking about one of our older patients who always made everyone smile despite everything he had been through. Without thinking, I had made that comment about people who carried light without noticing it. I remembered Adrian smiling into his coffee, but I had assumed he was thinking about the patient. Now I realized he had been looking at me. I kept reading. You make difficult days feel possible. You make frightened families feel heard. You remember birthdays, favorite snacks, and little details that everyone else forgets. I have watched you change people's lives without expecting anything in return, and somewhere along the way, I realized you quietly changed mine too. My throat tightened. Those were not exaggerated compliments written by someone chasing a fantasy. They were observations gathered over years, built from ordinary moments I had never considered important. I looked around the locker room, suddenly overwhelmed by how many ordinary moments had surrounded us every single week. The break room where Adrian always chose the chair across from mine. The supply closet where we joked about, whose handwriting looked worse on inventory sheets. The hospital garden where we sometimes sat for 10 minutes between shifts just to enjoy fresh air before going back inside. None of those memories had seemed extraordinary, yet somehow they had become the foundation of someone else's deepest feelings. The letter continued without asking for anything in return. If you never feel the same way, I hope you never feel guilty. Knowing you has already been one of the greatest gifts of my life. I would rather protect our friendship than risk making you uncomfortable. That single paragraph hurt more than any dramatic confession ever could have. Adrian had spent years carrying emotions that expected nothing, demanded nothing, and quietly accepted silence as the price of staying close. A soft knock on the locker room door pulled me back into the present. Linda stepped inside and offered a gentle smile. His sister just arrived, she said. She is asking for you. I carefully folded the letter, placing it back inside the envelope exactly as I had found it, but I could not put it back inside the wooden box. Instead, I slipped it into the inside pocket of my jacket without fully understanding why. As I followed Linda down the hallway toward the waiting room, one thought repeated itself over and over inside my mind. If Adrian had hidden his heart this carefully for years, what else had I completely failed to see that was waiting for me just beyond the next hospital door? Adrian's younger sister, Emily, looked so much like him that I recognized her before Linda even introduced us. They shared the same calm eyes and gentle smile, although hers was weighed down by worry after the long drive from Milwaukee. She stood the moment I entered the waiting room and wrapped me in a grateful hug before I had the chance to say anything. You must be Mason, she said quietly. My brother talks about you all the time. Those words landed differently now. Only a few hours earlier I would have laughed them off, assuming she meant stories from work. Instead, I simply nodded, unsure how much she already knew. We sat together near the large windows overlooking the parking garage while she filled out paperwork and answered occasional questions from the nursing staff. Between interruptions, she began sharing stories about Adrian that had nothing to do with hospitals. She described the boy who rescued injured birds, the teenager who insisted on mowing elderly neighbors' lawns without accepting money, and the man who never forgot anniversaries, birthdays, or promises. He has always loved taking care of people, she said with a tired smile. Sometimes too much. I found myself smiling as well. That sounds exactly like the Adrian I know. Emily looked at me for a moment before asking, "Did he ever tell you why he became a respiratory therapist?" I admitted that he had only said he wanted to help people breathe easier. She shook her head gently. When we were kids, our grandfather had severe lung disease. Adrian spent hours sitting beside him reading baseball magazines because Grandpa could not always talk for very long. He decided then that he wanted to help families have more time together. Somehow that simple story explained everything. It explained why Adrian never rushed frightened relatives during difficult conversations. It explained why patients always relaxed when he entered a room. It explained the patience that had become such an ordinary part of who he was that I had stopped noticing it. Later that afternoon, the attending physician stopped by with encouraging news. Adrian was expected to make a full recovery, although he would need several days of observation followed by weeks of rest before returning to work. Relief spread across Emily's face so quickly that she laughed through unexpected tears. I realized I had been holding my own breath until that moment. "You can see him soon," the physician said. "He is beginning to wake up, but he will probably be tired and a little confused." My pulse immediately quickened. I had spent the entire day uncovering pieces of a life that Adrian had carefully hidden from me. Now I was about to face the person who had written those words with no idea that I had already read them. Emily gently squeezed my arm. "Go first," she whispered. "He will be happy to see a familiar face." I slowly pushed open the hospital room door. Afternoon sunlight filtered through partially closed blinds, casting soft lines across the blankets. Adrian looked pale and exhausted, but the steady rhythm of the heart monitor filled the room with reassurance rather than fear. His eyes opened gradually, searching the room until they settled on me. For just a second, surprise crossed his face before a faint smile appeared. "Mason," he said softly, his voice rough from sleep. "You are here." I stepped closer to the bedside, suddenly forgetting every sentence I had rehearsed in the hallway. There were questions I wanted answered, letters I wanted explained, and years of unnoticed moments that had completely changed meaning. Instead, the only thing I managed to say was the simplest truth I had. "Of course I am." Adrian's tired smile grew just a little warmer, completely unaware that everything between us had already begun to change long before he had opened his eyes. The room settled into a peaceful silence that neither of us seemed eager to break. Adrian leaned back against the raised hospital bed, still looking exhausted, while I pulled the visitor chair a little closer without thinking. For years we had talked through noisy hallways, crowded elevators, and rushed meal breaks measured by the next patient call. Sitting together with nowhere else to be felt strangely unfamiliar. "I ruined your day off," Adrian said with a faint smile that carried more apology than humor. I shook my head immediately. "You did not ruin anything." He studied my face for a moment, almost as if he were trying to decide whether to believe me. "Emily made it?" he asked. "She is outside finishing paperwork. She has been worried, but she is relieved now." Adrian nodded slowly before closing his eyes for a second. "She always worries more than I do. That runs in families," I replied, earning the first genuine laugh I had heard from him all day. It was quiet and brief, but it filled the room with something warmer than any hospital blanket ever could. Over the next hour, we talked about almost everything except the things that mattered most. We discussed the baseball season, Daniel's terrible attempts at baking cookies for the staff lounge, and the renovation plan for the emergency department entrance. The conversation felt comfortingly familiar, yet every ordinary sentence carried a completely different weight now that I knew how much Adrian had kept hidden behind those easy smiles. More than once I almost mentioned the notebook or the letter waiting inside my jacket pocket, but every time the words reached the edge of my mouth, they stopped. Adrian deserved to tell his own story if he ever chose to. I refused to steal that choice from him. Late that afternoon, a physical therapist stopped by to help Adrian take a few careful steps around the room. I instinctively stood nearby, even though there was nothing for me to do. When Adrian finished and slowly settled back onto the bed, he looked embarrassed more than anything else. "I hate needing help," he admitted quietly after the therapist left. "You have spent years helping everyone else," I answered. Maybe this is your turn to let someone take care of you. He smiled without looking at me. That sounds like something you would tell one of your patients. Probably because it is true. Another comfortable silence followed. Outside the window, the afternoon sunlight began fading behind downtown buildings, covering the room in soft golden light. I suddenly remembered something tucked inside the wooden box. Do you remember that holiday party when everyone made fun of my sweater? I asked. Adrian laughed again, this time a little more freely. The one with the flashing reindeer? Nobody could forget that sweater. You were the only person who said something nice. He shrugged gently. Because you looked happy wearing it. Such a simple answer should not have affected me so deeply, but after everything I had learned, I finally understood that kindness had never been casual for Adrian. He noticed details because people mattered to him. Before visiting hours ended, a nurse entered with evening medication and smiled at both of us. You have had quite a few visitors today, she said while checking the monitors. Your coworker has barely left the hallway. Adrian looked at me with quiet surprise. You stayed all day? I hesitated only a moment before answering honestly. I could not imagine being anywhere else. His eyes lingered on mine longer than they ever had before, and although neither of us spoke another word, I had the unmistakable feeling that somewhere behind his tired smile, Adrian had begun asking himself a question almost as important as the one that had been growing inside my own heart. The next 3 days settled into a quiet routine that neither Adrian nor I ever planned, but both of us seemed unwilling to interrupt. I stopped by before every shift with fresh coffee from the little cafe across the street, and after work I returned with whatever book or magazine Emily thought might keep him entertained. Somehow those visits stopped feeling like favors and started feeling like the most natural part of my day. Adrian grew stronger with each passing morning, and the color slowly returned to his face. But there was still one subject neither of us dared to touch. The notebook remained inside my apartment. The letter stayed folded carefully inside my jacket drawer. They quietly followed me everywhere, even when they were not physically in my hands. One afternoon, after Emily stepped out to walk Adrian's dog around the hospital courtyard, Daniel wandered into the room carrying a paper bag that smelled unmistakably like fresh cinnamon rolls. Peace offering, he announced with a grin. Hospital food is terrible. Adrian laughed and accepted the bag while I poured 3 cups of coffee. For a while we talked about ordinary things again. A new resident had accidentally paged the wrong department 3 times in one morning. Linda had finally convinced administration to replace the ancient break room microwave. Life at the hospital continued exactly as it always had, almost pretending nothing had happened. When Adrian left the room for a scheduled scan with one of the transport nurses, Daniel remained behind to gather the empty coffee cups. He watched the door close before turning toward me. Have you told him? He asked quietly. I already knew what he meant. No. Are you going to? I stared down at my untouched coffee. I do not even know what I am supposed to say. Daniel leaned against the windowsill and folded his arms. Then maybe you should know one more thing first. I looked up. About 2 years ago, I asked Adrian why he never invited you out on an actual date. I thought the answer would be simple. I thought he was just shy. Daniel smiled sadly. Instead, he told me that every friendship has a door. If you force it open before the other person is ready, sometimes it never closes again. I remained silent. He said he would rather spend 20 years eating lunch with you as friends than lose you because he asked for something you could not give. Those words settled heavily inside me. They explained every careful step Adrian had taken, every anonymous kindness, every compliment hidden inside ordinary conversations. He had not been afraid of rejection nearly as much as he had been afraid of taking away my freedom to choose. Later that evening, Adrian returned to his room looking tired but relieved that another test had gone well. Emily soon left to pick up dinner, leaving the 2 of us alone again. The setting sun painted warm shades of gold across the room, and for several peaceful minutes neither of us spoke. Finally, Adrian looked toward the window and smiled softly. You know, he said, when all of this happened, my first thought was not about work or recovery. I turned toward him. What was it? He hesitated just long enough for my heartbeat to quicken. I was disappointed because I thought we were finally going to visit that little bookstore you keep talking about this weekend. I could not help smiling. It is not going anywhere. Adrian met my eyes with the same quiet warmth that had always been there, although I was only now learning how to recognize it. Good, he replied. I have been looking forward to spending a normal day with you for a very long time. Without thinking, I reached across the small space between us and gently rested my hand over his for the first time. He looked down in surprise, then back at me, waiting. I knew that the next words I chose would change both of our lives, because for the first time, I was finally ready to open the door that Adrian had spent years protecting. My hand remained gently over Adrian's, and for a brief moment neither of us moved. The steady rhythm of the heart monitor seemed louder than ever, not because anything was wrong, but because silence had finally become honest. Adrian searched my face with quiet uncertainty, almost as if he were afraid this simple gesture might disappear the second he acknowledged it. I smiled before I found the courage to speak. There is something I need to tell you. He gave a small nod, waiting patiently the same way he always had. I know about the notebook. His eyes widened just enough to reveal genuine surprise. Before he could apologize or explain, I continued. The hospital called me because you listed me as your emergency contact. Linda gave me your notebook, and later I found the letter in your locker. Adrian slowly closed his eyes for a second and let out the smallest laugh. I always imagined telling you in 100 better ways than that. I know, I answered softly. I read enough to understand that. He looked down at our hands. I never wanted you to discover any of it like this. Then why keep the letter? I asked. Adrian smiled to himself before answering. Because sometimes hope is easier to write than to say out loud. That sentence settled gently between us. There was no embarrassment in his voice anymore, only quiet honesty. I wrote that letter almost a year ago, he continued. Then I realized every time I planned to give it to you, I found another reason not to. Because you were afraid? He nodded. Not of hearing no. I could have survived that. I was afraid you would feel responsible for my feelings. I never wanted kindness to become obligation. Hearing him say those words aloud made the letter even more meaningful than it had been on paper. I squeezed his hand slightly. You spent years protecting me from a decision I did not even know I had to make. Adrian laughed softly. That sounds ridiculous when you say it. Maybe. I smiled. But it also sounds exactly like you. For the first time since I had walked into his hospital room, the weight between us began to disappear. We were no longer hiding behind ordinary conversations. We were simply telling each other the truth. I took a slow breath before admitting the one thing I had been afraid to say all week. I keep replaying the last 3 years in my head. Every lunch break, every conversation, every small thing you did that I never noticed. Adrian looked almost apologetic. You were never supposed to feel guilty. I do not. I shook my head. I feel grateful. His expression softened. Grateful, because you gave me the chance to see someone I somehow overlooked, even though he was standing beside me almost every day. His eyes shimmered with quiet emotion, but his smile remained steady. And what do you see now? I could have answered with a dozen different compliments, but none of them felt complete enough. Instead, I chose the simplest truth. Someone I want to know even better. Just then, Emily returned carrying takeout containers from Adrian's favorite neighborhood diner. She paused at the doorway, noticed our hands still resting together, and smiled so warmly that she quietly stepped back into the hallway for another minute before pretending to arrive again. Adrian laughed in embarrassment while I laughed with him, and somehow that shared moment felt wonderfully ordinary. Later that evening, as I helped him organize the books and cards on the windowsill, Adrian glanced toward me and asked with a hopeful smile, "When I am finally out of here, do you still want to visit that bookstore?" I smiled without hesitation. Only if you promise we take our time, because I have a feeling our first ordinary day together is going to mean a lot more than either of us expected. 3 months later, the bookstore finally happened, although by then it had become only one stop in a life that looked wonderfully different from the one either of us had expected. Adrian had completed his recovery and returned to work with the same calm confidence everyone at St. Andrew Medical Center admired, while I discovered that finishing a shift no longer meant rushing home alone. Sometimes we walked along the Chicago River with coffee in our hands. Sometimes we argued over which neighborhood served the best pizza. Sometimes we spent entire afternoons reading in comfortable silence, discovering that not every meaningful conversation required words. The hospital slowly adjusted to seeing us arrive together in the mornings, and after the first week, nobody acted surprised anymore. Linda simply smiled whenever she passed us in the hallway, while Daniel insisted on claiming credit for doing absolutely nothing except waiting long enough for two stubborn people to figure things out. Even Emily teased her brother every Sunday during family video calls, reminding him that keeping secrets had clearly never been his strongest talent. One rainy afternoon, after finishing another busy shift, Adrian and I volunteered at the children's reading corner that the hospital hosted every month. It had been my dream for years to expand the program, and now Adrian stood beside me helping children decorate paper bookmarks while parents relaxed for a little while. Watching him kneel beside a young patient to explain how to fold an origami crane reminded me of the tiny blue paper bird I had found inside his wooden box. Back then I had believed it was simply another keepsake. Now I understood that Adrian had always collected small reminders of hope because he believed ordinary moments deserved to be remembered. As the event ended, one of the nurses asked if we could help carry donated books back into storage. While organizing the shelves, I noticed the familiar Navy notebook resting inside Adrian's backpack. "Do you still carry it?" I asked with a smile. He nodded. "Every day. Did you ever change the emergency contact page?" Adrian reached into the notebook, opened the front cover, and quietly handed it to me. My name was still there exactly where it had always been, but now another line had been added underneath. Relationship, the person I trust with my heart and my ordinary days. I looked up at him, unable to stop smiling. "That is a little less subtle than before." He laughed. I finally decided subtle was overrated. We left the hospital together just as the rain began to fall. Instead of running for cover, we walked slowly beneath one umbrella, taking the longer route toward the river because neither of us was in a hurry anymore. As we reached the pedestrian bridge where the city lights reflected across the water, Adrian stopped and looked out over the skyline. "You know what surprises me the most?" he asked. "What?" He smiled thoughtfully. "I spent years believing that the happiest day of my life would be the day I finally told you how I felt. I was wrong." I tilted my head. "Then what is the happiest part?" He looked at me with the same quiet warmth that had been there from the very beginning. Only now neither of us had to hide from it. "It is everything that came after. The ordinary mornings. The grocery shopping. The coffee before work. The silence that no longer feels lonely. It turns out love was never hiding inside one big moment. It was waiting inside all the little ones we almost overlooked." I reached for his hand as we continued walking beneath the soft evening rain, and for the first time I understood that the most important call I had ever answered was never really about an emergency. It was life quietly asking whether I was finally ready to see the person who had been beside me all along, and every ordinary day since then had become my answer.